Hi, Ken.
Hi, welcome. Nice glasses. Why are you not wearing them?
Well, I will put them on if it turns out I need to refer to my notes.
Yeah.
I was very interested also in what you've been doing, your projects, and it seems to me that it's not just about art. I noticed that you're investigating the natural world there in these places, and why have that dualism at the Christensen Fund, and what's important to you to think about it in terms of that and culture?
We think that one of the consequences of that Cartesian division was most of the kind of problems we face in the world today, right now, and that one of the things that we as a global society are doing are trying to put things back together and develop a kind of a unified understanding of the planet, of diversity and so on and so forth, so that if we can be thinking in an integrated way where we don't separate biology and culture and so on, but instead see them as a more integrated whole, then we're probably going to tackle many of the kinds of fundamental problems that we have found. So we tend to be more comfortable with languages of creativity than languages of art. And so in our work with people that we might call, say, creative practitioners, they might be a farmer, say, but what they're doing, playing around with, germplasm or playing around with the structure of their land, might actually be, in some ways, what an artist might. Also, there are elements of creativity, parallel elements of creativity. So, and they may, many of the farmers we work with also turn out to be, musicians and all the rest of it. But, they've been, we don't come and look at them in this partitioned kind of a way. We try to look at them as a whole person who's engaging with constructing their world and changing their world, and really deploying a creativity that builds on a solid body of kind of experience as an artist would, but in this case as a farmer or as the manager of a sacred forest, which has an aesthetic, a biological, a physical, an ethereal component, and they're playing with that, and we're interested with the people who can lift and manage that in a holistic kind of a way.
This sort of holistic approach, I've been hearing a lot today about science trickling down to people, or art or science, and it seems to me that there's this problem that we have right now that's part of this turmoil that John is mentioning, that's something about, certainly science is this epistemology that has these functions, but I wonder about this way of living where we slice things up, where we have art and science, and it comes from this way or that way, and it seems to me that what you're referring to is a different way of grabbing a whole bunch of different ways of knowing and just utilizing them as a citizen or a person. And you're looking for other models maybe elsewhere to bring back here to this kind of dual, this culture that likes to talk in binaries, and maybe binaries isn't always so good. Maybe it's great for a clock, but not for us.
I think even, when you actually talk to scientists outside of a, in the right kind of context, they don't have particularly a different view on creativity and so on. I think that, and likewise, if you talk to artists in all of these areas, there are kinds of discipline, and there are kinds of learning, and then there's creativity. I think what we haven't got in so actually I think what's going on is actually, and what people are feeling is actually much smarter and much more holistic. It's just we haven't got a language to discuss it in our institutions. I think that's the problem.
So you think things are better, not worse?
Things are a little better. They are better. It depends on what time scale we're talking about. But, things are a lot better than the 1950s,
I think so.
Yes, they are better, and they're getting better. But we have to develop a new language which enables institutions to be comfortable. We've got to get out of our entanglement in the disciplines, you know, as really an 18th, 19th century notion. And we've gotten ourselves fossilized in them because of the way we've structured our universities primarily and the university funding mechanisms. And it's really tangling us up because their rationale really has disappeared. I mean, are there really ideas that we have in one area of the social sciences which don't flow across all of those ideas? Is it really true that we're using different methodologies in these different disciplines? I mean, first of all, we've had, you know, the biologists are using what the chemists used to use, and the chemists are using what the physicists used to use, but they're still defending that, no, this is physics, this is chemistry, whatever. All of this is known, it's obvious, but we just haven't found a way to spring out of it. And we need to find a way to spring out of it. And when we do, I think not only will we find that we're even more effective at using science in a more integrated way and have better able to deal with complexity and the multidimensional reality, but I think also we'll create a society which has a much greater capacity for self-direction and self-awareness, and I think that'll be a good thing too. And I think artists are working on this as hard as scientists are working on it. I think that the idea that artists are no longer engaging in the same discourse as scientists is also much less the case.
In the copy of Nature from last week that's in my purse, there's an article in there about do-it-yourself biologists. And there's a lot of speculation in there about whether or not these people that are doing this, building their own labs, and I know that Ken has an exhibition about art about this too, so I hope we can talk about this too. But there's this big discussion: will they do anything meaningful? Will these people who are in these labs do any real science? Will they ask the right questions? Will they? How will this contribute? Of course, it's this. You know, it's lovely that they're getting in, and it creates good citizens and all of this. But there's probably maybe a healthy skepticism. I don't know, but it seems to be this creative act that looks a lot like artists, or looks a lot like hobby. It looks a lot like makers of things, an artisanal idea. What do you think about that?
I think that we will find that some of them, because of brilliance or good luck or whatever, will do the next big things. And I think that's always been the case. I think that one of the most surprising thing for me was I was expecting to see a significant rise in citizen science. And I was expecting them to use the web, and I was expecting that we would be having much more intelligent discussions about almost everything. And I thought this was a good thing, because, you know, I think that it's important to take debate around ideas outside of institutions, and I'm very worried, obviously, about the private sector's control of ideas. But one of the really striking things to me, or disappointments to me, is that as yet we haven't gotten very far on that. And if you actually look on the web for citizen science debate, you know, you get into climate change, you get into all of this kind of stuff. You don't tend to get into a debate where you know, which is really taking things forward. But I think that may go. You know, that what we've seen in the last decade may not be a portent for the future. We may begin to see increasing space on the web where people are able to debate unconstrained and actually more interested in truth.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. The term citizen science is kind of, it feels like a made-up thing and is suspect to me anyway. And I think that there may be this assumption that everything is, well, first of all, science, as we know it, isn't really very old in the age of human experience, and so perhaps we should be a little more patient about that. But also, I think there's great reason to be optimistic about people doing things. It's just not happening maybe where you expect it. I know there's a biologist working up in Oregon or Washington, and she's working in prisons with prisoners to do mycology and observations and investigations, because these gentlemen have to spend a great deal of time in isolation or in this incarcerated condition, and so they make great observers of mushroom, of fungi change. And in fact, as a result of things like that, one of these people, I understand, is now going on to get, going through the typical academic world of getting, at least a bachelor's in biology. There's another group of people who are, I think, recording certain kinds of the change in the biological climate change in a rare plant up in the Oregon forest, and that's because they're people that usually hunt them or collect them to sell illegally, but certain biologists know that they have a very specific and strong knowledge, and so now there are these kinds of collaborations, and they're beginning to ask questions now.
Right.
I mean, it's got to go from sort of scientists deciding what the important question is, and this sort of idea that I heard of trickle down to something more osmotic, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, yes. If you only allow idea generation in one direction, all you can do is add a decimal point to a measure you already wanted.
Yeah.
So, we do a lot of work in this area. We do a lot of work with indigenous knowledge holders who live, in close proximity to, the variables in their world. And they live in societies where they don't think someone else is responsible for knowing what's happening. Because we live in a society where we tend to think someone else is going to measure anything. There's no need for us to know what's happening. Someone else is going to tell us what the temperature is, or how much rainfall, or whether something's safe to eat. But they don't live in a society like that. They hold this responsible. So, needless to say, and you'll have always heard this 1,000 times, it is unbelievably extraordinary how closely and how skillfully people, and with what discipline people measure events, and how valuable that is, and how I'm a scientist, and when I started to do field work on this, I was absolutely just stunned. I would do some massive statistical analysis of rainfall, and it would come out within about 1% of what old people would tell me about the dates and times of. It was like, shit. How could this be possible? So that has been happening, but we still have a sort of a filter where basically every time science discovers something, then you'll hear that, well, and here's the backup is that locals knew it too. But right. If locals try to say something before that has been discovered, there was a species of fish in this African river that I worked on once, about 400 miles from the sea. So the fishermen told me that was a kind of a fish, and they would describe this weird thing on its stomach, and I don't know what. And this is when I was doing my doctoral. My doctoral supervisor said, "This has to be mythical. What are you going on about?" I was saying, "No, they're telling me it's not mythical." Anyway, it turned out that it was a sea fish that actually migrated upriver, and yes, it did indeed feed through a stomach on its mouth that it would fix onto it. There's a lot out there in the world which doesn't seem to be very likely at the time, and sorting it all out, being open enough to all the different realities is quite complicated. But we need to do that, because what we have not, what we're only now really getting means, to build our Western science, we had to develop the reductive method. But now our problem was we got very good at the dimensions of the universe that are not the middle dimensions of the, we got really good on very tiny time frames and very long time frames. We can be quite predictive about that, and really tiny spatial and really massive spatial time frames. And those are the ones we probed with our science. And we found it much more difficult to deal with because it was too complex, the the middle time frames, understanding what happens in a landscape rather than what happens on a tiny patch of land, what happens over generations rather than on a short period of time. But most of our problems as a society are now in that time frame, and that's where we're going to have to find ways of dealing with other forms of knowledge, which have proven much more. They've had to be much more concerned with those effects. I mean, I'm not very interested in what indigenous thinkers might have to say at 10 to the minus 5 meters times spatial frames. But I'll tell you that they will be better than I am on a landscape level time frame for quite some time. So that's where I'm really interested, at how we can explore methodologies for understanding those diverse complex processes that are happening on those spatial and temporal time frames.
And how do you imagine utilizing those kinds of knowledge in our setting? I mean, I worry sometimes about sort of just borrowing the surface of a culture. It's sort of like, everybody's afraid of genetically modified foods, which I don't know is necessarily fear, but it's like you can't take just one thing maybe out of a culture and plop it into another and expect it to be like the cure for our problems, or can you? What do you think?
You don't achieve system change by by planning what the one thing, if you added it, was going to have the right result. That's not how things work. You have to be both more experimental, but you also have to think about the whole dynamics of something. So the idea. Well, it's all part of our culture. I mean, when a Western person goes to visit a sacred mountain, they'll have a spiritual experience within the first few hours. The local guy saying that, well, usually we get one of those every 20 years, but you guys from California are pretty quick. So sometimes we think that too. We think that it's possible to solve incredibly complicated questions, scientific or otherwise, really rather easily and rather quickly. I don't think that's the case. I've been studying one particular society in Africa now for 25 years, and I find I was majorly wrong about something, regularly.
Well, what are some of those things you were wrong about? What are some of those assumptions or things that you've disproved for yourself?
Well, I've been fascinated about why the big reductions in child mortality. And 25 years ago, I was one of the people who was really stunned by the degree to which maternal education was correlated with declining mortality. And that still shows up in this sample, but it shows up much less than it did 25 years ago, and I'm beginning to realize how many other variables I wasn't seeing under the surface.
So it's more complicated than you thought.
Everything is a little more complicated than you thought. Never be convinced by a statistical correlation. So we didn't get to talk enough about the creative process in art and its relationship to science.
Yes.
From your side.
Well, maybe we can talk about that a little bit next one.